Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
Hello and welcome to Sundazed. Now, last week's show is already history, but if you caught last week's show, then you'll know that we were talking about horrible histories because we went to see it at the Theatre Royal, and we were lucky enough to interview Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn about their life and times. What we saw then was Terrible Tudors. What we didn't see was the Vial Victorians, which was also on at the same time. So I'm going to read from Terry Deary's Villainous Victorians this week, and a pretty dreadful bunch they were as well, by all accounts. This is Terry Deary's introduction to the Villainous Victorians. History is horrible. People in the past did dreadful things to one another and committed terrible crimes. They still do. But by the 1800s, the laws had become even more cruel than the crimes. If you were caught chopping down someone else's tree, you could be hanged. The laws became so cruel you could feel just as sorry for the villains as for the victims. The prisons were full of poor people who pinched pennies by picking pockets. Posh people didn't have to mug and murder to make money. They owned the filthy factories and murky mines where the poor slaved and suffered. Many mine owners didn't mind how many died in their damp and gas-filled pits as long as they themselves made lots of money. So, in the dark days of Queen Victoria, who were the real villains? The poor, pilfering people of the slums? Or the mean, miserly men in their massive mansions? And how would you have got on in those terrible times? Teachers may tell you Victoria's Britain was an exciting place, but it was also a time of cruelty and wickedness. What you need is a book that tells you the other side of the story, the villainous Victorians. Now, where will you find a book like that? Terrible timeline, 1830s to 1840s. 1837. In July 1837, a seriously weird artist, Robert Cocking, jumped from under a hot air balloon to test a parachute. Robert was 61 years old in 1837, quite a wrinkly at that time. His parachute looked like an umbrella when it's blown inside out. It was made to carry his weight, 90 kilos. Sadly, Robert forgot to add on the weight of the parachute itself another 110 kilos. Robert had a drink of wine, took off his coat and climbed into the basket under the parachute. A hot air balloon carried the whole thing 1.5 kilometres into the air over London. He called up to the balloon pilots, "I never felt more comfortable or more delighted in my life. Well, now I think I shall leave you. Good night, Spencer. Good night, Green." Brave Bob pulled a rope and let the parachute go. He fell towards Greenwich in London. He fell very fast. The stitching that held the parachute was a bit feeble. The basket fell off, and Robert was smashed on the ground like a hedgehog on the motorway. And it was, "Good night, Cocking. I don't think he can hear you." And Cracker's Cocking was crocked. In July 1837, a seriously weird woman called Victoria became Queen of Britain. Queen Victoria became famous for saying, "We are not amused." But though she never said it, she did write in her diary, "We were very much amused." Tubby Victoria reigned for another 63 years, and even though she didn't do a lot, the last 60 years of the 1800s are known as the Victorian Age. So her name is remembered. Victorian men and women like Brave Bob went round the world doing daring and daft things. They risked their lives so that people like you and me can live in a different world. Well, somebody had to try things like parachutes so today's airmen can fly safely. But while brave though batty people like Robert Cocking are forgotten, unbrave though fatty people like Victoria are remembered. Is that fair? No. Most history books tell you about the famous and the fortunate. There are a few thousand of them, but most history books don't tell you about the forgotten and the failures. There are millions of them. Yet we can learn just as much from the failures as we can from the famous. It's time someone wrote about the real people in Victoria's world. A world full of wild, wacky, wonderful people like Robert Cocking, as well as vile, vicious and villainous people like Jack the Ripper. So here are some of the famous and fortunate, along with the forgotten failures, because it takes both to make real history. Famous and Fortunate, 1838. Isambard Brunel builds the first steamship to cross the Atlantic, while railways take people all the way from London to Birmingham. Brits are going places fast, but with lots of choking, sooty smoke. Brunel himself almost choked on a coin that he swallowed doing a children's magic show. He invented a machine to turn himself upside down and shake it out. Forgotten and failed, 1838. William Lovett creates the Charter. The Chartists want votes for all men, but not women, of course. They get a great petition together and take it to Parliament. But Parliament throws it out, and Lovett ends up in prison. He came out and tried selling books, but that didn't make him any money. Neither did teaching or writing school books. He died in poverty. Famous and fortunate, 1842. Thomas Arnold dies, and he was only 47. He is one of the few people ever to become famous for being a teacher. He taught at Rugby School, a school where the senior boys had been teaching the younger boys how to riot. Spoilsport Arnold put a stop to that. Terrible Tom Arnold also brought in the teaching of French, foul, and mathematics, miserable. Blame him. Forgotten and failed, 1842. Billy Bean shoots at the Queen, but his gun has more paper and tobacco stuffed into it than gunpowder. Then, on the 29th of May, John Francis fired at Her Unpopular Highness and missed. He went back the next day and fired with an empty pistol. Couldn't afford the powder. Neither is executed, and Queen Victoria is furious. Billy and John, forgotten failures. Famous and fortunate from 1843. Charles Dickens, the writer, is having a bad time. His latest book, Martin Chuzzlewit, is not a huge hit, and he's running out of money. Will he have to give up writing novels and get a proper job? No, because this year he writes the best-selling blockbuster, A Christmas Carol. Everyone is saved. Dickens, Scrooge, and Tiny Tim. Forgotten and failed from 1843. Frances Evans is a Welsh preacher's daughter. She leads rioters into the Carmarthen workhouse where Francis and the poor people of the town have been suffering. Soon soldiers arrive and batter them. All the rioters want is better food, free tools and freedom. Not a lot. The riot doesn't do much good. Famous and fortunate from 1848. Thomas Babington Macaulay writes a big fat history of England, so blame him for your history tests. He says England is gradually getting better. For him, maybe. He says he isn't too bothered about any mistakes in his writing, so he'd never pass his SATs tests then. Forgotten and failed from 1848. Father Mackintosh is a good Scottish priest. The Irish famine is remembered, but people forgot that Scots suffered at the same time when their potatoes rotted and they starved. Lord Cranston at Arisaig doesn't care about his clan. Hero Mackintosh is left to help them. Many die anyway. A little further on in the book, Terry Deary talks about putrid prisons. Putrid prisons were for more serious crimes. Were these punishments fair or foul? In 1846, William Cleghorn killed Michael Riley in a boxing match and went to prison for 6 months. In 1873, Thomas Clark sent a chimney-sweep lad up a 30-centimetre wide pipe where the boy suffocated to death. Clark got 6 months in prison. In 1875, Isabella Riley went to prison for 7 years for stealing a purse with £10 in it. Isabella was 19 years old. William Lee stole a dress that had been put out to dry and got a whipping as well as 2 months in prison. 11-year-old Ellen Woodman was part of a girl gang caught stealing scrap metal. She was sent to prison for 7 days. Horribly hard labour. When convicts went to prison, they didn't just sit around and chat, they had to work, taking thick, rough, used ship ropes and untwisting them so that the material could be used again. The work often made their fingers bleed. But it was even tougher when the judge sent them to jail with hard labour. Sometimes this meant breaking stones with a hammer. And if there weren't any stones to be broken, the prisoners were often given silly jobs just to exhaust them. Jobs like shot drill. And here we have a report from Prison Life Weekly. Our reporter has been inside Pentonville Prison to see the conditions there. He is happy to report those evil men are really suffering. If you've ever had your pocket picked or your house burgled, then you'll be glad to see this, dear reader. Here is the sort of punishment a man can expect if he is sentenced to hard labour. There are 3 lines of men. At the end of each line is a pyramid built from cannonballs. Each ball is as heavy as a sack of coal. The man on the end must lift a cannonball off of the top and put it down. The next man must pick it up. So each cannonball goes along the line. The last man puts it down at his end of the line. This goes on until the pyramid has been built at the other end of the line. Once that has been done, they begin to move it back again. This goes on and on, backwards and forwards, for an hour and a quarter. By this time the men are quite worn out. Maybe they will remember this next time they think about stealing your wallet. A reporter said the men worked till they sweated. A few seconds' rest might be allowed, but mostly the prison warders shouted and bullied the men to keep going. A warder said, "The hardest part is picking the cannonball up. There's nothing to get hold of and their hands are slippery with sweat, so it's like a greasy ball. The work makes the shoulders very stiff too. Makes your PE lessons look easy, doesn't it?" Anyone who failed to do the shot drill could be sent to work the crank. That is, turning a handle on a machine, a handle that a strong man could turn once every 3 seconds. But in Birmingham prison the punishment was to turn it 10,000 times. Even a fit man would take over 8 hours to finish. Prison pain. Young criminals would also be set to work on the crank. If they failed, they were fastened into a straitjacket, tied standing to the wall of their cell for 4 to 6 hours. If they fainted, they had a bucket of cold water thrown over them. This happened to one boy called Lloyd Thomas 3 days in a row. Lloyd was 10 years old. Another boy, Edward Andrews, refused to work the crank. He was punished for 2 months before he managed to hang himself. Edward was 15 years old. No one was punished for the cruelty that drove Edward to kill himself. The crank was last used in 1898. Fry and fry again. One woman, Elizabeth Fry, led the fight to make 1800s prisons less cruel. In Preston prison, the treadmills were replaced with weaving looms so the prisoners could do some useful work. Good idea? Not everyone agreed. Some people fought against her. They said prisons should be tough. The Reverend Sidney Smith, for example, argued that a prison should be a place of punishment and it should fill a man with horror. It should be a place of real suffering, painful to remember, terrible to imagine. Work should be as dull as possible, pushing and pulling instead of reading and writing. Food should be no better than water, gruel and flour puddings, for thieves are greedy people. Mrs. Fry is a pleasant woman, but her way is not the way to stop crimes. But Mrs. Fry slowly made changes. Thanks to her, there were separate prisons for men and women, different punishments for serious and not so serious crimes, useful work and training, better food, warmth and clothing for all. But it's Liz Fry who is famous and remembered, while Savage Sid is forgotten. Again, a little further on, Deary talks about terrible transportation. Really serious villains were sent to America in the 1600s, but the Americans rebelled in 1776 and refused to take any more of Britain's criminals. After all, they had enough of their own. About the same time as America rebelled, Captain Cook discovered Australia, a big, almost empty place for dumping British villains. They were usually sent for 7, 10 or 14 years to suffer hard labour. Imagine that, sent away from your damp slum houses, your dreadful diseases, your smelly streets and your putrid water, to the horrible sun and fresh air of Australia. Ugh. The journey was a punishment in itself, though. It took 4 or 5 months in a rickety sailing ship. Out of every 100 prisoners transported, 1 would die before they even got to Australia. This transportation to Australia lasted until the 1850s. How bad did you have to be transported? It depended where you lived. In Yorkshire you were transported if it was your 3rd crime. In Warwickshire and Dublin you were transported if it was your 2nd crime. In Leeds and Manchester you could go to Australia for your 1st crime, and age didn't much matter. Children weren't supposed to be transported till they were 14, but younger ones were sent early in Victoria's reign. Terrible transportation facts. Girls were hardly ever transported. Out of every 8 convicts transported, only 1 was a woman. Young villains were taught in a school on the ship. Who was the schoolmaster? A convict, of course. Transportation schools taught about an hour of English and an hour of maths each day. At the end of the week there was always a test. The most terrible transportation? Probably a boy sent to Australia at the age of 6. It was said he could hardly talk properly. Transported villains could be punished again if they did wrong in Australia. A transported boy of 16 grew to hate his prison officer so much that he attacked him with an axe. The officer's leg was so badly injured that it had to be amputated. The boy was hanged. Horrible hulks. When the prisons filled up, the courts had to send criminals to hulks. These were old ships that were too ancient and rotten to sail. They were left in the river to rot and were filled with prisoners. They were crowded, damp and full of rats. There was even a hulk for young criminals, the Euryalus. The work was boring and the kids kept themselves amused by bullying. The only escape was to fall sick and get onto the hospital hulk, the Y. So, how did you get onto a hospital ship? Don't try this at home. Want a break from those bullies? Want a trip to hospital? Then all you need is a brass button, soap, rum and a bandage. First, heat the button till it is really hot and place it on the arm or leg. It will make a nasty, painful blister. Not enough for hospital, though. Now, rub soap and rum into the burn. Cover it up with a bandage for a couple of days. Take off the bandage and you will have a lovely festering sore. Show it to the doctor and off you go to hospital. Here's one I made earlier. And if that doesn't work, why not simply break an arm? Sometimes a friend would help to break your arm. They'd hold your arm on a bench, then let a dinner table fall on it. Ouch. Miserable mother. A child was taken to court in Birmingham. He was a thief. The judge said to the child's mother, "If I set the boy free, will you take him home and make sure he behaves?" "Certainly not." "Would your mother rather see you in prison than take you home?" Better not ask her in case she says yes. The judge had to send the boy to a hulk. The boy was too feeble to take it and died. He was 6 years and 7 months old. A young Victorian villain who got what he deserved. Villainous Victorian victim. And finally we're going to read from the section called Hanging Around. Execution in Victorian Britain was by hanging. Up to the year 1868, convicted people were hanged in public, and crowds turned up to watch. They turned it into a bit of a holiday. One of the most famous executions of Victoria's time was of Mr. Frederick and Mrs. Maria Manning. The Mannings had killed Patrick O'Connor after inviting him round to their house for a meal. O'Connor was a rich moneylender and the cutthroat couple planned to rob him. First, Maria shot O'Connor and then husband Frederick beat him to finish him off. Frederick told the judge, "I never liked him much." "Thank you, Frederick. I think we might have guessed that." The terrible twosome buried O'Connor under their kitchen floor but were found out and sentenced to hang. A public execution was also a chance for pickpockets to work in the crowds. One thief described the fun he had at the Mannings' hanging. "Mrs. Manning was dressed beautiful when she came up. She screeched when the hangman pulled the bolt away. I made 4 shillings and 6pence at the hanging. I nicked 2 handkerchiefs and a purse with 2 shillings in it. It was the best purse I ever had." Mrs. Manning was dressed beautiful in a black satin dress. After the hanging, those dresses suddenly went out of fashion. Wonder why? As usual, reports of the murder and the hanging sold thousands of copies at a penny a time. These reports were called broadsides, and some of them were written in verse. The Manning Murders. The Mannings planned O'Connor's murder. Nothing could the poor man save. The dreadful weapons they prepared, and in the kitchen dug his grave. As they fondly gave him supper, they slew him. What a dreadful sight! First they mangled, then they robbed him, Frederick Manning and his wife. Old and young that do pass by, do not rob or take a life. For the murder, see them hang there, Frederick Manning and his wife. Models of the Mannings appeared in Madame Tussauds Waxwork Museum in London. Visitors went along and threw coins at the wax dummies, though that probably didn't hurt as much as the hanging. A reporter sneered, "George Manning is greatly improved by his appearance in Madame Tussauds. He looks like a very clean undertaker." That's a bit unkind to undertakers, who are very nice people. Charles Dickens was at the Manning execution and wrote about it with horror. It gave him nightmares, and he was a grown man. Dickens changed Mrs. Manning's name to Hortense and put her into his book Bleak House. Did you know? The Victorians may have been ruthless when it came to hanging people, but they were better than 30 years before. Before Victoria came to the throne, they hanged children. In 1800, a boy of 10 was hanged. The judge said, "We don't want children thinking they can get away with crimes." In 1801, a boy of 13 was hanged for breaking into a house and stealing a spoon. In 1808, 2 sisters were hanged in Lynn for theft. One was aged 11. Her little sister was just 8. In 1831, just 6 years before Victoria took the throne, a 9-year-old boy was hanged at Chelmsford for setting fire to a house. Anyone under 7 was too young to be hanged. The problem was there were no birth certificates to prove your age until 1837. How did you know if that person was too young to hang? Scaffold school. But what about the children who went along to an execution? If adults were sickened by the horror of hanging, then surely parents wouldn't take their children along to an execution. But many did. After all, it was a lesson. The last man to suffer hanging in public was Michael Barrett. What might a child have made of the day of his death? It was a picnic. Thousands of men, women and children stood in the square outside Newgate Prison. They chattered and laughed and tucked into their breakfasts. A few hundred of the richer ones sat at the upstairs windows of the houses opposite the prison. They paid good money for the view. Outside the prison wall stood a wooden platform. There was a scaffold above it with a dangling noose, and in the floor was a trapdoor with a bolt. As 8 o'clock struck on the prison clock, the babble of noise dropped to a murmur. The prisoner, Michael Barrett, was led out of the prison, his hands tied. "What are they doing with that man?" a child's voice piped through the quiet morning air. "They're going to hang him by the neck till he's dead," his mother murmured. "Why are they doing that?" the child asked. "Because he's wicked. He killed 20 people, the woman hissed. A gentleman beside her said, "It was 12 people dead and about 100 injured." "12 then," the woman sniffed. "Did he shoot them?" the child asked, and had pictures in his head of a dozen loaded guns. "No, my child," the man sighed. "The man on the platform is Michael Barrett, an Irishman. His friends were locked away in Clerkenwell prison and he tried to get them out." "How did he do that?" the child persisted. "He took a barrel of gunpowder and put it up against the prison wall. He thought his friends were on the other side of the wall, and when it was blown down, they'd be able to escape." "And did they get away?" the child gasped, her round eyes blinking. "No, the prison officers knew something was going to happen, so they locked the prisoners away. The blast blew down the wall, but it also wrecked a lot of houses in the street called Corporation Row nearby. A lot of people died." The child turned pale and looked back towards the wooden platform. The prisoner in his dark red coat and striped grey trousers was climbing to the top of the platform with a steady tread and talking to the priest who was waiting there. Then the door in the prison wall opened again and the crowd gasped with horror. A powerful old man with a grey beard stepped out. He wore a tight black cap and a dark cloak. He was the grimmest and ugliest man the child had ever seen. She shrank behind her mother's skirts. "That's William Calcraft, the executioner," the man explained. "A butcher. His victims always die a slow and painful death. I don't know why they keep him in the job." "Because no one else would do it," the woman said. She was pushed in the back as the crowd jostled and surged towards the platform to get a better look. The child was so tight against her mother's skirt that she couldn't see what was happening at the scaffold. The girl turned to the man. "Lift me up," she pleaded. "No," he said. He took a fountain pen and a notebook from his pocket and began to scribble words. He glanced up and saw the executioner disappear beneath the scaffold. A hush fell on the vast crowd, so great that the child could hear sparrows fighting on the rooftops and the scratch of the man's pen. There was a grating sound as the bolt of the trapdoor was pulled. There was a gasp from the crowd, then a roar and a half-hearted cheer. "That's what the Fenians deserve," a man cried. "She's fainted," a woman groaned, and the girl turned to see a young woman being carried out of the tightly packed crowd. "That's Michael Barrett's girlfriend, poor girl." The man sighed and scribbled some more. "I couldn't see anything," the girl sighed as the crowd turned away and began to thin. The man put his pen and his notebook back into his pocket. "And you never will," he said to the girl. "What do you mean?" The man tugged his dark beard. I mean, this will stop soon. Hanging men in public will stop. It's barbaric, something from the Middle Ages. The public have no right to see it. Children should not be allowed to see it. The girl's mother turned an angry shade of red. Teach the child a lesson. That's what happens to killers. The man shook his head. The people here today didn't come to learn a lesson. They came to see an innocent man murdered with a rope. Innocent, the woman jeered. What do you know? A jury found him guilty. Who are you to say he didn't do it, eh? The girl had never heard her mother so angry. The woman waved a finger in the man's face. Hey, go on, tell me. Who are you? She ranted. The man raised his hat politely and said quietly, My name is Dickens, madam. Charles Dickens. You may have heard of me. He patted the girl on the head and turned away from the mother, whose mouth hung open foolishly. Can we go and look at the dead man now, Mum? The girl asked. The mother wrapped a shawl around the child's head and dragged her off down the street. No, child, no. Let's go home. Michael Barrett was a Fenian. The Fenians were Irish people who didn't want English Queen Victoria ruling them. They tried to drive the British out with bombs and killings. In 1881, the Fenians tried to blow up Salford Army Camp, but only managed to kill a 7-year-old boy. The Fenians were dangerous, but not very successful. There were 8 attempts to kill Queen Victoria in 60 years. 4 of those were Irish attempts. In 1887, Victoria went to Parliament to celebrate her 50 years as Queen. There was a Fenian plot, just like Guy Fawkes, to blow her up with her ministers. Several ministers knew about it and were sure that they could stop the attack. They did, but they let Vic take the risk anyway. Barrett said at his trial, I have never deliberately injured a human being. I love my country, and if it would help Ireland, I would willingly sacrifice my life. I will meet death without a murmur. Many people believed him when he said he'd hurt no one. They said the police bribed and bullied people to say that they saw Barrett at the scene of the Clerkenwell explosion. Barrett had to die to make it look as if Victoria's police were doing their job. Many years after Barrett's death, another Fenian admitted that he planted the bomb that exploded at Clerkenwell. Barrett was innocent, so the police were suspected of telling porkies. Charles Dickens was so sickened by public hangings that he was one of the people who spoke out against them and had them stopped. 3 days after Michael Barrett was executed, the law was changed, so no one was ever hanged in public again. So there we are, a few grisly facts about the villainous Victorians. Well, times change. Of course, we don't hang anybody in this country anymore. I think the last person was hanged sometime in the 1960s. Ruth Ellis, if I'm not mistaken. So we've gone from not hanging people in public to not hanging people at all, which, in my opinion, is quite right too. Not a nice thing to do. Well, if Horrible Histories comes back to the Theatre Royal in Norwich, I would strongly recommend that you go and see it, whether it's the Awful Egyptians or the Gorgeous Georgians or stuff from World War II or World War One. It's all fascinating, and it is good, as I say, to get a picture of a different side of history, to learn about the people who were not so famous. And although, in the case of the Victorians, for example, they did come up with many great inventions, it was, in a lot of ways, still a very barbaric society. And you can see how far we've come. And in some ways, you can see how far we've come and how much society has improved for the better. But of course, as Terry Deary points out, sometimes people still do dreadful things to one another. But we hope that you will all sleep safe in your beds tonight. And for now, that's all. We'll talk to you again next week.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.